Tensions in the Middle East have entered a deeply volatile phase, with nuclear safety now at the center of global concern. As conflict intensifies between Iran on one side and a U.S.-Israel coalition on the other, the spotlight has turned sharply toward one of the region's most sensitive and potentially catastrophic flashpoints, the Bushehr nuclear power plant. Built with Russian assistance and operational since 2011, the Bushehr facility remains Iran's only functioning nuclear power plant and a critical component of its energy infrastructure. In recent days, however, it has become something far more dangerous, a potential trigger point for a wider disaster. In a sign of growing urgency, Russia has begun scaling back its presence at the site. According to the latest confirmed reports, Moscow's state nuclear agency Rosatom has evacuated an additional 163 staff members, leaving roughly 300 personnel still on site. This is not an isolated move, but part of a border-phased withdrawal, with officials indicating that more evacuations are likely as the situation continues to deteriorate. The decision reflects not just precaution, but a recognition of how dangerously close the conflict has come to nuclear infrastructure. Rosatom had been actively involved in expanding the Bushehr site, working on additional reactor units. However, that construction work has now been suspended following the outbreak of hostilities. Behind the scenes, Russian authorities are preparing further contingencies, aiming to reduce staff to essential levels if instability persists. The urgency surrounding Bushehr escalated dramatically after a projectile struck near the facility on March 18. International monitoring bodies confirmed that the object landed within the plant's premises, but did not damage the reactor or cause injuries. Even so, the margin for disaster was alarmingly thin. Satellite analysis and subsequent reporting suggest the impact occurred just a few hundred meters from the reactor core, close enough to raise serious fears about what might have happened if the trajectory had been slightly different. Russia's nuclear leadership described the incident as unprecedented in a modern conflict involving an operational nuclear facility. The implications are stark. Bushehr houses significant amounts of nuclear material, including fuel and waste, meaning any direct strike could trigger a regional catastrophe with global consequences. The Kremlin has responded with unusually strong language, warning of the catastrophic risks tied to any military action targeting nuclear infrastructure. We consider the launching of strikes, the launching of attacks against nuclear facilities potentially exceedingly dangerous and fraught with possibly even truly irreparable consequences. The statement reflects growing anxiety in Moscow that the conflict could spiral into a nuclear disaster scenario, not necessarily through deliberate escalation, but through miscalculation. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov reinforced this concern in public remarks. He said the possibility of strikes on nuclear infrastructure is extremely dangerous. Russia has also confirmed that it has directly communicated these concerns to the United States, urging restraint and warning against targeting sensitive sites like Bushehr. The message from Moscow is clear. Nuclear infrastructure must remain off limits, regardless of the intensity of the conflict. At the same time, the broader conflict itself has been escalating rapidly. What began as targeted strikes has evolved into a wider confrontation with missile and drone exchanges, now spanning multiple parts of the Middle East. Casualties are rising, infrastructure is being damaged, and regional stability is increasingly at risk. Iran has responded to earlier attacks with retaliatory strikes, including reported actions near Israeli nuclear-related facilities. This tit-for-tat dynamic is raising fears that both sides may continue pushing boundaries, increasing the likelihood of a major incident. What makes the current situation particularly alarming is the intersection of conventional warfare with nuclear-adjacent targets. International norms have long treated nuclear facilities as off-limits due to the catastrophic humanitarian and environmental consequences of any damage. That line now appears increasingly blurred. The Bushehr incident marks one of the first known cases in recent history where a projectile has landed within the perimeter of an operational nuclear power plant during an active conflict. Even though the structure was not directly part of the nuclear reactor system, the precedent itself is deeply concerning. Russian officials have been blunt in their assessment. He said this is unacceptable. Once nuclear sites become part of the battlefield, even indirectly, the entire risk calculus changes. The danger is no longer confined to immediate military objectives, but extends to long-term environmental and human consequences. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the global watchdog for nuclear safety, has been closely monitoring developments. Following the March 18 incident, the agency confirmed that there was no radiation leak, the reactor remained intact, and no staff injuries were reported. Despite this, the IAEA has issued repeated calls for restraint. Its leadership has emphasized the urgent need for communication and de-escalation to prevent a nuclear accident. He said we must return to diplomacy and negotiations. The agency remains in ongoing dialogue with both Iran and Russia, underscoring the international dimension of the crisis. The presence of foreign personnel and international oversight adds another layer of complexity, making any escalation even more dangerous. One of the most troubling aspects of the Bushehr incident is the lack of clarity surrounding the origin of the projectile. Different parties have offered conflicting accounts. Russia and Iran have suggested involvement by U.S. or Israeli forces, while some analysts have raised the possibility of an unintended or misfired projectile. No conclusive evidence has been publicly released. This ambiguity adds another layer of risk. Without clear attribution, the chances of miscalculation or retaliatory escalation increase significantly. In such a tense environment, even uncertainty can become a trigger for further conflict. In response to the growing threat, Russia has proposed the creation of a protective buffer zone around the Bushehr facility. The idea is to ensure that all parties recognize and respect a no-strike perimeter around nuclear infrastructure. While the proposal has gained some international attention, its implementation would require cooperation from all sides, a difficult prospect given the current hostilities. The importance of Bushehr goes beyond Iran's domestic energy needs. The facility represents a major symbol of Iran's nuclear capabilities and a key site involving international cooperation, particularly with Russia. It also contains large quantities of nuclear material, making it a highly sensitive location. Even though Bushehr is a civilian power plant, any damage could have consequences far beyond Iran's borders. A serious incident could lead to radiation release, environmental contamination in the Persian Gulf, and disruption of global energy markets. The crisis at Bushehr is part of a broader regional escalation that is becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Airstrikes, missile launches, and retaliatory attacks are now occurring across multiple countries with no clear path toward de-escalation. Diplomatic efforts are struggling to keep pace with the rapid developments on the ground. Russia has been particularly vocal in pushing for negotiations as the only viable solution. He said this is the only thing that can effectively contribute to the de-escalation. Yet, as the conflict intensifies, the window for diplomacy appears to be narrowing. The risk is that continued escalation could eventually reach a point where control becomes difficult, if not impossible. What makes the current moment especially dangerous is the convergence of several high-risk factors. There is active military conflict involving major powers, proximity of strikes to nuclear infrastructure, unclear responsibility for incidents, and rapid escalation cycles with limited communication between adversaries. Taken together, these elements create a situation where a single misstep could have irreversible consequences. The warning signs are already visible. Even without direct damage to the reactor, the psychological threshold has been crossed. Nuclear facilities are no longer untouched by conflict. That alone marks a significant shift in the nature of modern warfare. For now, Bushehr remains intact. Radiation levels are normal and no casualties have been reported, but the margin for safety is shrinking. Russia continues to evacuate personnel and push for restraint. The IAEA is urging diplomacy. Analysts are warning of unprecedented risks, and the world is watching closely. Because in a conflict where missiles are landing just hundreds of meters from a nuclear reactor, the difference between crisis and catastrophe may come down to mere seconds and a slight change in trajectory. The situation remains fluid, unpredictable, and deeply dangerous. And for the first time in this conflict, the threat is no longer just regional.